This lesson is about exploring scientific notation, so you will learn the rules on writing numbers in scientific notation. So you can see at the top of our notes, we have a times 10 to the nth power, and that is the general form of a number in scientific notation. We have some rules that we have to follow. The first rule is that the absolute value of the first factor is greater than or equal to 1, but less than 10. Remember, those bars mean absolute value. The first factor up here is this a. So the absolute value of a has to be greater than or equal to 1, but less than 10. So we can write that a little bit more mathematically. 1 is less than or equal to the absolute value of a, which is less than 10. So it can't be equal to 10. It has to be less than 10. The second rule is that we multiply by a power of 10. So as you can see in the example up here, we are multiplying by a power of 10. So the first number had to be between 1 and 10, and then we multiply by a power of 10. So we take some number and we multiply it by some power of 10. And then the third rule deals with the exponent. And in this case, up here, the exponent is n. The exponent has to be an integer. And hopefully from the work we did in topic 1, you understand what an integer is. I will remind you that an integer has no parts to it. So it is a whole number or its opposite, which means it can be a positive or a negative number, but you shouldn't see any decimals or fractions in that number. So we have some number, and we're going to call it a, times 10 to some power, and so this exponent right here has to be an integer. No decimals and no fractions are allowed. It can be positive or negative. So let's go through some examples of numbers that are in scientific notation and numbers that are not in scientific notation. So this first example is 6.67 times 10 to the negative 11th. So it follows all three rules. The first rule is that this number has to be between 1 and 10, which it is. The second rule is that you have to multiply by a power of 10. And the third rule is that this exponent has to be an integer, which means no decimals or fractions are allowed. Now, the next part on our table is what the calculator might look like. It really depends on the type of calculator you're using, but you might see this number as 6.67 e negative 11. So you might see that on your calculator. This e stands for the exponent of the power of 10. So negative 11 is the exponent, and that's what that means. So this is how some calculators write scientific notation. Another example would be negative 3.8 times 10 to the 4th. Now this is in scientific notation because when we look at the first number, its absolute value, which is 3.8, is between 1 and 10. We are multiplying by a power of 10, and the exponent is an integer. So on your calculator, you might see negative 3.8 e 4, and that's the same thing. A last example might be something like 5 times times 10 to the 50th power. So, you don't have to have a decimal point. The rule is that this number has to be between 1 and 10, which it is. We're multiplying by 10, and the exponent is an integer. So on a calculator, this answer might look like 5E50. Alright, now let's show some examples that are not in scientific notation, and then I will explain why they are not. So the first one is 58.3 times 10 to the 14th power. So if we take a look, the first number has to be between 1 and 10. 58.3 is not between 1 and 10. So that's why this one is not in scientific notation. So you need to write that down for the reasoning. 58.3 is not between 1 and 10. Another example that is not in scientific notation would be -7 times 8 to the 10th power. So if we take a look at our rules, the first number's absolute value has to be between 1 and 10. So that works. 7 is between 1 and 10. The second rule is we have to multiply by a power of 10. So here we're not multiplying by a power of 10, we're multiplying by a power of 8. So that's the reason this is not in scientific notation. Pause the video if you need time to write that one down. And moving on to a third example that is not in scientific notation is 7.438 times 10 to the 1/2 power. So this is not in scientific notation. Let's take a look at the rules. The first number is between 1 and 10, so that works. We are multiplying by a power of 10, so that works. The exponent, though, has to be an integer, and 1/2 is not an integer. So the reason this one is not in scientific notation is because 1/2, the exponent 1/2, is not an integer. So make sure that you have taken all of these notes, and you should be good to go with writing numbers in scientific notation, or identifying if numbers are in scientific notation.